Welcome to Sunday School in Review with Annie Covington. This week's lesson is a continuation of the fall quarter of the New International Series. The title of the quarter is Worship in the Covenant Community. It is comprised of a study of worship practices that's offered as a grateful response to covenant relationship that God initiated. First, he initiated with Abraham and later with the people of Israel. The pattern of worship reflects the scope of community life, from praising God's goodness and mercy to calling on God for help in times of crisis. The lesson for October the 27th is lesson 9 of the fall quarter, and it is the fourth and the last lesson in Unit 2. The title for Unit 2 is Songs of the Old Testament. In this unit, we have so far looked at the various songs that Israel used in worship and prayer. While we may not know the melody of their songs, we can get a sense of the mood embedded in the lyrics and what the writer felt in the presence of God's power and goodness. Lesson 9, which is the final lesson of the unit, looks at Psalm 62, which is a song of trusting God. The topic for this week is trusting God alone, and that's in the commentary. And in the adult Sunday school book, Let the Silence Speak. This is a psalm of David, and is a great psalm to turn to find comfort and encouragement, especially for someone who is tempted to lose faith in God. Both the background scripture and the print passage are coming from the entire chapter of Psalm 62, and it has 12 verses. The resources I will be using are going to be the Life Principle Bible, the Faith Series Sunday School Curriculum, and the Townsend Press Sunday School Commentary. So get your Bible study material and follow along as we look into this week's lesson. The key verse says, "Yes, my soul, find rest in God. My hope comes from Him." Now, this is verse 5, and I will be using the New International Version. This verse is an encouragement for believers to wait patiently on the Lord as we submit to Him, knowing that hope lies only in God and not in any human effort or circumstances. As we go through the lesson, let us reflect on the following question. Question number 1. What does it mean that God is your rock and salvation? Question number 2. How does the fact that God is your rock and salvation affect your sense of security and stability? And question number 3. What can you learn from David's experience about silence, patience, trust, and waiting on the Lord when facing adversities? Now, before we go into the lesson, let us look briefly at the biblical context of the lesson. And first, I want to ask the question, do you sometimes feel overwhelmed by the challenges of life? When these challenges cause you to fret, do you ask yourself, how and where can you find relief and calmness? In Psalm 62, David points to God for the answers. He finds his needs are met when he quietly waits on the Lord. Although he was under attack, he had peace because he knew that God was the one he could trust in for salvation, stability, and protection. He silently waited before God as he surrendered to the Lord's sovereignty, trusting that God was his refuge. Psalm 62 is not a prayer, nor is it a praise, but it is a sharing of the confidence that David had in God. He expresses his total dependence on the Lord and asks for nothing. Instead, he professes his full trust and faith in God without fear. Psalm 62 is an individual psalm of David's expression of trust in God, but the exact situation that led to the writing is unclear. It is believed to have been written during the time when he was being threatened by King Saul. Yet, in the face of such threats, he continued to express his unwavering commitment to God. Verses 3 through 10 are framed between a confession of finding rest in God in verses 1 and 2, which will be the first two, and an explanation of the reason of such trust, which is going to be coming from 11 and 12, and they are the last two verses. From what is given in the psalm, we can discern that David had been under attack by his enemies who had flattered him with their words, while at the same time they were secretly plotting against him, saying that David was like a leaning wall, a tottering fence, indicated one thing, that is, that they believed he was weak and easily defeated. However, David continues to express his unwavering trust in God throughout the psalm, with the confidence that God will protect him and will bring justice to those who seek to harm him. The psalmist, by seeking stillness and quietness, found God's salvation. This refers to God's deliverance, his rescue, and also his redemption. In quiet contemplation, we too can find hope and assurance that God is indeed with us. He offers the salvation we need from life's challenges. Whereas Psalm 62 is a profound expression of David's trust in God amid adversity, it also encourages us to seek moments of stillness and quiet to find God's salvation, find his hope, refuge, and deliverance as well. It serves as a reminder that even in the frenzies of life, there's a place and calm waiting for us, a place where we can connect with the divine. When we wait on God, we can find refuge in him. We are also able to acknowledge the ultimate futility of placing trust in human strength or human wealth. Like David, we can find refuge in stillness and quietness because doing so encourages us to turn within ourselves. It is during these times when we pause our minds that we can reflect and connect to our inner self. Throughout the hustle and bustle of life, intentionally seeking stillness provide an opportunity to hear our thoughts and perhaps even hear God's voice. This correlates well with Psalm 46:10 when God says, "Be still and know that I am God." The lesson aims for this week are: number one, review the role of stillness and silence in defining Israel's relationship with Yahweh. Number two, experience the calm that comes from knowing God as a source of peace and protection. And number three, recall an experience when turning to God in silence brought greater peace than turning to alternative sources of solitude. There are four themes that resonate throughout this psalm, and I'm going to give you those. Theme number one, total dependence on God. The psalm emphasizes that true rest, salvation, and security comes from God alone. By looking at David's example, believers may be encouraged to place their hope in God rather than in human strength or material wealth. Theme number two says, trusting God in times of adversity. David maintains his trust in God even in the face of deceit and attacks from enemies. He sees God as his refuge and continually reminds himself of God's protection and salvation. His confidence increases because his belief in God's trustworthiness. And then number three, human frailty versus divine strength. Humans are transient and fragile, regardless of our status. God, on the other hand, is eternal, he's powerful, and he is loving. The contrast in the two should teach us that it is futile to trust in human effort or riches. These things are fleeting. They are here today and gone tomorrow. And number four, God's justice and love. As the psalm concludes, we are reminded of God's justice. There is assurance that his moral order will prevail as he ultimately judge everyone according to their own deed. The psalm will be taught in three outlines, and I will share the main thoughts from each of those outlines. Outline one, waiting in silence, will come from verses 1 through 4. Outline two, security in God, from verses 5 and 8 through 8. And section three, Outline 3, recognizing God's power, will come from verses 9 through 12. So now let us go through the biblical analysis. Outline 1, waiting in silence, verses 1 through 4. The main thoughts we're going to look for here are going to be number 1, there is rest and peace in God. And number 2, God is our protection amid adversities. So I'm going to read verses 1 and 2. Truly, my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from Him. Truly, He's a rock and my salvation. He's my fortress. I will never be shaken. David begins with verses 1 and 2 by emphasizing his personal trust in God. He silently waits for the Lord, who is his rock and his defense. The repetition of the word truly in both verses reinforces his focus and reliance on solely on God alone, with the acknowledgement that salvation and protection comes only from Him. It was God and God only that saved him from his adversities. Using metaphors like rock and fortress highlight the unshakable and protective natures of God's presence. David declares that God is his rock and salvation to convey stability and deliverance in addition to his protection. David finds rest and peace in God that transcend all circumstances. His trust remains unshaken. Therefore, he believed that he will not be greatly moved. His quiet, confident trust shows the close relationship he has with God. His trust deep is a deep conviction that God alone is his strength and security. And then when we look at verses 3 and 4, this is how they read. How long will you assault me? Would all of you throw me down? This leaning wall, this tottering fence? Surely they intend to topple me from my lofty place. They take delight in lies. With their mouth they bless, but in their hearts they curse. In these verses, David shifts from his personal relationship with God to his adversaries. The phrase, how long will you assault me, in verse 3, reflects his prolonged distress and longing for relief from the assaults on him. The implication is that he is indirectly addressing his attackers at this time. They perceive his vulnerability and therefore assaults him, causing David to feel surrounded by people who are trying to bring him down. The imagery of a leaning wall and a tottering fence emphasizes weakness and instability. David was at a weak point in his life, and just as one would topple a fence or wall, his enemies sought to overthrow him. In verse 4, David identified his adversaries as hypocrites who thrive on deception. They seek to undermine David's remaining strength. They are deceitful, blessing outwardly but cursing inwardly. They were friendly to David in his face, but they were cursing him in their heart. The use of the word they implies that he was threatened by multiple adversaries who wanted to destroy him in his weakness. Despite their efforts, David's confidence in God remains unshaken. Amid their betrayal and attacks, he does not lose sight of where his true security lies, and that is in God. His enemies delighted in their falsehood as they pretend to honor David in his face, while waiting for just the opportune moment to bring him down. Despite his enemies' plot, David trusts that God will protect him and ultimately bring victory. His adversaries' deceptions are no match to God's protection. And then as we go into outline 2, security in God, coming from verses 5 through 8, the main thoughts here are, number 1, God is our refuge and the foundation upon which we can rely. And number 2, no matter who we are or what our status may be, we can find refuge in God's love, which transcends all human barriers and limitations. I'm going to read verses 5 and 6. Yes, my soul find rest in God. My hope comes from him. Truly, he is my rock and my salvation. He's my fortress. I will not be shaken. David had an unwavering faith in God's character. He affirms that God is his source of safety and he feels secure in the face of his adversaries. He turns to God for comfort and strength, putting his hope in the Lord alone and letting us know that no matter what we are going through, we can always find consolation and relief in God's love and protection. We must not allow ourselves to become fearful or frustrated because of the sinful action of others, but instead we should turn to God and His Word. Isaiah 54:17 tells us that no weapon forged against you will prevail, and you will refute every tongue that accuses you. This is an encouragement to wait quietly on the Lord. Verse 5 is a repeat of the themes in the first passage, but this time there's more emphasis on personal exhortations. There's a beautiful progression from speaking about God's protections in verses 1 and 2 to commanding his own soul to find rest in that truth in this verse. As David's faith grows deeper and as he preaches to his own soul the truth he knows about God, he is once again reminded of the security that is found in the Lord. Although God is metaphorically described as a refuge and fortress, the truth of his safety, protection, and strength is very real. The metaphor of a rock in verse 6 further emphasizes God's unchanging support. Just as a rock provides stability, God is the foundation upon which we can rely, knowing that He will never falter or abandon us. And then I'm going to read verses 7 and 8. My salvation and my honor depend on God. He is my mighty rock, my refuge. Trust in him at all times, you people. Pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge. In verse 7, David once again reiterates the fact that God is his rock and refuge upon whom his salvation and honor depends. His protection and honor comes from God alone. Then in verse 8, he moves from personal reflection to communal exhortation. He speaks directly to the congregation, encouraging them to trust in God and pour out their hearts to him because God is a refuge for all who seek him. The phrase pour out your heart suggests that God is not only a protector, but also deeply relational. He listens and he cares. David's call to trust in him at all times is a powerful reminder that God is faithful in every situation during both good and bad times. In verse 8, David lets us know that no matter who we are or what our status may be, we can find refuge in God's love, which transcends all human barriers and limitation. And then when we go to outline 3, the last outline, recognizing God's power, coming from verses 9 through 12. The main thoughts here are number 1, God rewards individuals based upon their actions. And number 2, our hope should be firmly anchored in God, the ultimate source of all good things. So I'm going to read verses 9 and 10. Surely the lowborn are but a breath, the highborn are but a lie. If weighed on a balance, they are nothing. Together they are only a breath. Do not trust in extortion or put vain hope in stolen good. Though your riches increase, do not set your heart on them. In this passage, David reflects on the futility of trusting in human status or wealth. Whether lowborn or highborn, all human beings are but a breath, a fleeting, insubstantial thing. Common people are as worthless as a puff of wind, and the powerful are not what they appear to be. Things we often strive for in life, such as fame, wealth, and power, are fleeting and they are not permanent. Therefore, trusting in these and other deceitful means is foolishness. Riches may grow, but they provide no ultimate security. The temporary nature of human life contrasts with the eternal and solid nature of God. David warns against trusting in wealth, which can easily become an idol for us. Instead, we should focus on bringing our relationship with God, building that relationship, and trusting in Him, especially during times of hardship and uncertainty. He is the only constant in our ever changing world, and there is nothing in comparison to His lasting power and provision. In verse 10, David teaches not to trust in or engage in any form of extortion or to profit from stolen goods. Although one's riches may increase, he is saying to not place confidence in evil means or personal gain. Do not rely on people's or riches, but place your ultimate confidence totally in God, especially during hardship and uncertainty. And then in the following two verses, verses 11 and 12, this is what they say. One thing God has spoken, two things I have heard. Power belongs to you, God. And with you, Lord, is unfailing love, and you reward everyone according to what they have done. Verse 11 reinforces God's omnipotence. David makes a declaration of the Lord's attributes, which are his power and his unfailing love. These two characteristics of God, his might and his mercy, are essential to understanding God's character. In verse 12, the psalmist emphasizes that divine justice will always prevail. The righteous will be rescued, while the wrongdoers will face consequences. This echoes Proverbs 24 and 12, which says, does he not pay everyone according to what they have done? This is a powerful reminder that God is just and that He is also faithful. The verse also emphasizes God's love and the concept of divine justice, where He rewards individuals based on their actions, with each person being rewarded according to his or her deeds. It reminds us of God's faithfulness and assures us that our deeds do not go unnoticed. This passage of scriptures reinforces the main theme of the psalm. That is, God alone is trustworthy because he is both powerful and loving. His justice assures that evil will not ultimately prevail. David's confidence rests in the knowledge that God, in his strength and love, governs all things justly. We are encouraged to trust in him and to recognize his protective nature. When we put our faith in God, we are rewarded with a sense of peace and fulfillment that cannot be found in material possession. In conclusion, let us remember that Psalm 62 is a call to unwavering trust in God. David models how to respond to life's trials with steadfast faith, resting in the knowledge that God alone is our rock, salvation, and refuge. The psalm invites believers to reject the false security of wealth and human power and instead find peace and hope in the power and love and justice of God. Our hope should be firmly anchored in God, the ultimate source of all good things. In God, we can find comfort and security in times of uncertainty and distress. Waiting on God requires us to surrender our own efforts to rely completely on His wisdom and power instead. Waiting patiently for His promise to unfold is not always easy. But like David, we can learn to do so with quiet confidence. We can take inspiration from David's words and learn to wait patiently on God's promises. Let us anchor our hope in the Lord and find rest in His loving arms. When we trust in Him, we can face any situation with quiet confidence and unwavering faith. This concludes our lesson for this week. Thank you for tuning in for this review. I truly hope you have been enriched. Don't forget to click the subscribe, like, and share buttons. And until next week, I pray God's blessings on each of you.